In the previous episode, we examined how financial bubble formed through a gradual process, rising asset price, expanding credit, and reinforced expectation interact with each other, creating a system that may appear stable on the surface while becoming increasingly fragile underneath. In this episode, we turn to a force that doesn't create bubbles by itself, but largely determines how powerful and how dangerous they eventually become. That force is leverage. At its most basic level, leverage means using borrowed capital to increase the potential return of an investment. In principle, leverage is not inherently problematic. In fact, it is one of the foundational mechanisms of modern finance. It allows a business to expand, household to acquire an asset, and economies to accelerate growth over time. But leverage has one defining characteristic that make it different from most other financial variables. It doesn't simply increase returns, it amplifies outcomes in both directions. When asset prices rise, leverage enhances profitability and makes investment appear more efficient and more attractive. But when the asset price began to fall, the same leverage accelerates losses often faster than the system can absorb them. To understand this more clearly, let us consider a simple example. Imagine an investor buying an asset worth 100 units using 20 units of personal capital and borrowing the remaining 80 units. If the asset rises by 10%, its value increases to 110 units. The investor's equity rises from 20 units to 30 units, which means a 50% return on the investor's own capital. But if the asset falls by 10%, its value declines to 90 units. The investor's equity falls from 20 units to 10 units, which means a 50% loss. So in this example, a relatively small movement in the asset price creates a much larger movement in the investor's own capital. This asymmetry is the defining features of leverage. Now let us extend this logic from one investor to the broader financial system. When leverage is widely used by banks, hedge funds, and corporations, the amplification effect is no longer isolated. It becomes systemic. During periods of expansion, the system-wide leverage can create the appearance of a strong, stable growth. The asset price rise, the balance sheet expand, and credit becomes easier to obtain. That in turn fuels even more economic activity. But this apparent stability depends on one condition: asset price must continue rising or at least remain relatively stable. Once that condition breaks, the dynamic of the system can change very quickly. To illustrate this process, we can return to the 2008 financial crisis. In the year leading up to the crisis, the major financial institutions operated with extremely high level of leverage. Some large investment banks in the United States maintained the leverage ratio about 30-1. In simple terms, for every 1 unit of capital, it controlled more than 30 units of asset, financed largely through borrowing. At that level, even a small decline in asset value could significantly erode institutional capital. Once housing prices began to fall and mortgage-backed securities started losing value, the financial institution saw their balance sheet deteriorate rapidly as losses accumulated. Lenders and counterparties began to question whether these institutions were still solvent, and credit conditions tightened. Access to funding become more restricted. The system entered a process known as deleveraging. Deleveraging means institutions are forced to reduce debt and stabilize their balance sheet. In practice, that often means selling assets, but when many institutions try to sell the assets at the same time, market prices fall even further. The falling prices create additional losses. Those losses force even more selling. This creates a negative feedback loop. Falling prices trigger forced sales, and forced sales push prices even lower. At this stage, the system moves from expansion into contraction. And what first appeared to be uncontrolled market correction begins to evolve into a broader financial crisis. From a structural perspective, the key insight is this: leverage transforms gradual changes in asset prices into rapid and often destabilizing adjustment across the financial system. Without leverage, the asset price correction tends to remain slower and more contained. With leverage, the same correction can spread quickly through financial institution, credit market, and eventually into the real economy itself. This leads us to an important conclusion. Leverage doesn't create risk by itself. What it does is concentrate risk and accelerate risk during periods of growth. This concentration of risk often remains invisible because the rising asset price hides the underlying vulnerability. But once condition reverse, the same concentration of risk can suddenly becomes a source of systemic instability. And if we connect this back to our previous discussion on bubbles, we can see how these two mechanisms interact. Bubble created the condition of mispricing and overvaluation. Leverage determines how severe the consequences become, because when those mispricing begin to correct together, bubbles and leverage form a dangerous combination, and this combination has appeared in almost every major financial crisis in modern history. As we move forward in this series, we will examine the next critical components of the process: liquidity. Because while leverage amplifies moments, liquidity determines whether a financial system can continue functioning under stress or whether it freezes entirely. Leverage doesn't make a system unstable by itself. It makes them fragile when conditions change.